Lost Medias. With the gaming industry always evolving, there are several projects that ended up being cancelled without being able to receive the recognition they deserved. And in this video, I'll be covering most of the cancelled and lost horror video games Iceberg. And I'm Sir Chris. I explore the internet and I make videos about it. Let's go. In this tier, I will talk about games that many people know, and as we go deeper, I will talk about games that almost no one knows. So let's begin with PT. This one doesn't even need an introduction, but PT, or better known as Playable Teaser, was an exclusive demo for PS4 of one of the most beloved franchises, Silent Hill. The game consisted of a loop of a hall that over time, the scene will get more sinister and macabre, like the never-ending sound of the radio blasting about families that were killed by their own fathers. And even a haunting of one of the victims, Lisa, who was killed by her own husband with a knife. Where at the end of the torment, we are shown a cutscene of a character walking through Silent Hill. Until in 29th of April of 2015, the game was cancelled and removed from the store forever. It even seems like a crime cancelling this game. Sadness. Sadness was a survival horror game for the Wii that ended up being cancelled in 2010. It focuses on the story of our protagonist, Maria Lengyel, where her life is turned upside down in a single hour. During the train journey of the family to Lviv, which is a city in Ukraine, the train ends up derailing. This accident kills her husband and leaves her son, Alexandre, blind. With this sudden change, his mental state quickly decays to the point where he develops narcolepsy, an intense phobia of the dark, and schizophrenia. Now, Maria had to protect her son, who is completely vulnerable against monsters from Slavic mythology. This game also promised to have 8 endings, but the only ending we got was the cancelled game. Resident Evil. A classic. Resident Evil 2 was one of Capcom's games that was released in 1992. But there's a version of this game that you have never seen. But first, Resident Evil 2 is a game that focuses on a city infested with zombies. And in it, we play as Leon S. Kennedy, who on his first day ends up facing this tremendous horror. But as said, there was another version that ended up being discarded. In 2015, leaks began to surface on the internet, showing us the unfinished and less polished version than we know today. This version quickly was called by the community as Resident Evil 1.5. Which ended up being discarded because the developers were not satisfied with the final product. And so, they started over again. But fortunately, there were fans from the community who dedicated themselves to finish the unfinished. And since we're talking about Resident Evil, did you know that there was another unfinished game, but this time for the Game Boy? Before Resident Evil Gaiden, there was another game simply called Resident Evil, which consisted on the story of our 3 protagonists who ended up escaping into the mansion, where from there, the game begins. It was supposed to come out in March 2000, but when the day came, Capcom allegedly cancelled it because they weren't confident in its quality. And this game eventually fell into the hands of players. Cabin in the Woods. Cabin in the Woods, besides being a film, was supposed to be a campaign for the classic game Left 4 Dead 2. If you live under a rock and you don't know anything about this game, that's okay. Left 4 Dead 2 is a multiplayer game which takes place in a zombie apocalypse, where 4 survivors have to face various types of zombies until they reach one of their objectives, a safe room, in which at the end of the campaign they will have to do a last stance to be rescued. But the film consists of a group of students who spend their vacation in a cabin that does not appear on the GPS, in which this cabin was in the middle of the forest, that at first glance already looks very suspicious. As things unfold, they begin to be hunted by zombies, and thus, they discover the secrets beneath the cabin. And with this idea came the ambition to collaborate with Valve so that this could become a campaign. Information about this campaign is a bit scarce, but from what we know, this campaign will have our protagonists find the cabin, and they will have to fight the monsters from the film. Everything seemed perfect, until the film was delayed 1 year, and then another, and then the rights of the film were sold to another company, and allegedly, Valve simply left. Dead Space 2. Dead Space 2 is a sci-fi horror game which places us in the year 2508, where now humanity has started to spread across the universe due to the lack of resources on the planet Earth. Of the planets, the story focuses mainly on AG-7, where an illegal mining ship called USG Ishimura is attacked by alien life. With this, Isaac, our protagonist, is sent to repair the ship while he has to fight against these monsters. This game was also supposed to be released for the Wii, but eventually, the only 2 people working on this build ended up cancelling it. Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 doesn't need any introduction, especially now with the remake. But did you know that in the beginning, this game was meant to be different? In an old build for the GameCube, the trailers showed a totally different game. In it, our protagonist, which still is Leon S. Kennedy, was inside of a mansion haunted by a presence in the form of a dark fog, while at the same time, Leon seemed to be also infected and thus possessed supernatural powers. But in the end, he ended up being discarded and they started over again, in which the version that we know today came out. City of the Dead. City of the Dead was a PlayStation 2 game which was being developed by Kujo Entertainment. The story consists of a fictional island called Ningún Futuro, which means no future, where a zombie virus breaks out and ends up infecting the whole island due to secret military tests. According to the only surviving trailer that was shown at an event, it is said that the game contained high levels of blood and to the point that it even ended up being excessive. Stranger Things. Stranger Things, again, doesn't need an introduction. This series was going to have its own game, including one that was being developed by TTG, as we can see through a trailer that was posted. The trailer shows us the strange and yet interesting style of scenes that took place in the first season of this series. And alongside this game, there was another one that was being created to accompany the previous one, and it was supposed to be called Kids Next Door. Hellraiser and Nightmare on Elm Street. Hellraiser, in addition to being a film, was also a cancelled game that was being created in the 90s. The game was being developed by Color Dreams, a company that was allegedly known for making low-quality games at the time, where one day, after seeing the film, they decided to make a game with the idea of the film. The film involves a round-the-box that opens a portal to the alternative world of the Cenobites, and the game consisted of a character who was trapped in the puzzle box, where to escape, he had to solve the puzzle twice, which while solving, he would modify the level around him. That after escaping from the Cenobites, he still had to solve the puzzle for the second time to defeat the demons that came out of it. But if this game is inside of this iceberg, it means that it was cancelled. And since we're talking about a game that came out of a movie, there was another game which came from the Freddy Krueger movie, A Nightmare on Elm Street. A film where teenagers' dreams were interrupted by the presence of Freddy Krueger, who was a serial killer of that city, where if they died in a dream, they would die in real life. In the game, we supposedly played as one of the teenagers walking around Elm Street looking for the only way to defeat Freddy, which was to destroy his bones while constantly fighting to stay awake. But if we fell asleep, things would get worse. But unfortunately, this game followed the other and both fell into silence. Silent Hill Prototypes. Silent Hill tells the story of Harry Mason, a father who searches for his daughter who was lost in the fictional town of Silent Hill. In its searching for her, he ends up encountering a cult that wants to perform a ritual to bring an abomination to the town. In 2007, there was a proposal for a game from this franchise for the Wii called Silent Hill Cold Heart. This game consisted of an emotional unstable student named Jessica Chambers, where she suffers from nightmares and insomnia. When one day, to get her head off her thoughts, she decides to go visit her parents, in which she gets lost in an aggressive snowstorm and she follows an ambulance that takes her to Silent Hill. This proposal seemed promising, so much so that there would be a deep psychological system which would develop as new fears were unlocked, and they would affect the rest of the game. This was not the only proposal. Later, another developer studio called Climax USA came up with another proposal for this franchise, but unfortunately, these proposals did not move forward. Fear Effect Inferno. Fear Effect Inferno was the supposed third episode of this saga, which ended up being cancelled without a reason being given. Fear Effect focuses on the 3 mercenaries who are our protagonists, Anna, Glass, and Deke, who were in need of money and so they decide to find Ya Ming and keep her as a prisoner as she was the daughter of a leader of a criminal organization. But everything starts to fall apart from the moment that Jim, their spy, is kidnapped and from then the rescue begins. But this third episode would start with 4 mercenaries, the 3 from the beginning plus one called Rain, where Anna asks for help from the other mercenaries to kill Minx, who was the head of the organization in which Hannah worked. There are several speculations as to why the game was cancelled, and they go as the game lacked quality to the development progress being slow. but to this day it remains a mystery. Call of Cthulhu. Call of Cthulhu is a 2006 game where the story consists of our protagonist, Jack Walters, not Jack Walton, a private investigator who suffers from amnesia and is trying to find answers about a mysterious case from 1915. With the release of this game, 2 sequels were planned, but later on were cancelled, and they were called Destiny's End and Beyond the Mountains of Madness. Little is known, but Destiny's End tells the story of 2 characters, Jacob and Emily, in which Jacob has bizarre dreams that are linked to a mysterious town called Innsmouth, and they both try to discover the macabre meaning behind it. This game consists on the synergy mechanic, as both had advantages and disadvantages. But Mountains of Madness is an interesting case, as it follows its own path with a single character, Robert Naples, who was an archaeologist whose objective was to recover stolen artifacts. This sequel took place years before the Second World War, and as the war was already imminent, the Germans were looking for a city which was allegedly possessed by power in Antarctica. But in Berlin, they carried out experiments on creatures that were taken out of the ice, and from there, they discovered a secret frozen and forgotten by time. Even with potential, the sequels ended up being cancelled, as they allegedly were unable to find a publisher. Alone in the Dark 5 and The Abductions. Back in 1992, Alone in the Dark was known for its innovative graphics, which even won a Guinness Award. In it, we played as Edward Carnby, a paranormal investigator who is sent to investigate a haunted mansion, where inside, strange things begin to take place. But there was one episode that never saw the light of day, Alone in the Dark 5, which was supposed to be the 5th chapter in the series developed by Atari. It ended up being cancelled, but it was not the only one, because there was another called Alone in the Dark: The Abductions. Nothing is known about both games, other than the fact that they were mysteriously cancelled, and only a few fragments of what they were meant to be survived. Redwood Falls. Redwood Falls was a game that was being developed by Cujo Entertainment in 2006, but when the company was purchased, the new owners were not interested in this project, even though it was super impressive what 7 people managed to create. The story took place in a small town in Antarctica, where we were a police officer. Nothing happens in that town until one night, something mysterious fell from the sky, and then on, hell came to Earth. Various reports of missing animals and people. With that, our character, alongside with more agents, end up exploring the forest, where there, the new intruder was infecting everything. And as the story begins to unfold, the city would begin to be more affected, whether emotionally or physically. The game was so ambitious to the point that they even planned to make several classes of enemies, where the lower class served as food for the higher class. But unfortunately, we will never see this game in action. Chucky Wanna Play. This one is simple. A cancelled game that was inspired in the Chucky movie called Chucky Wanna Play. This game consisted of us playing as Chucky, where in several chapters we had to kill people who were in those levels. The first chapter being the Brewster Apartments. This game ended up being cancelled because allegedly, the company wasn't able to raise enough funds to finish the game. But fortunately, this lost media was recently found by Relay through a dev kit. Kurayami. Kurayami was a proposal for a PlayStation 3 exclusive, which was a psychological horror game from the company Grasshoppers. In the game, we had to explore a mysterious castle, along with the town near that same castle. And the game was based around light and darkness, where light brought comfort and security, while darkness was the completely opposite. The player was forced to explore those areas with only a torch, while at the same time having to solve several puzzles and escape the dangers of darkness. But this game was just a proposal. Black Death. Black Death was a survivor horror game similar to Dead Island that was being developed by Dark Works in 2011. It places us on the American northeast coast, where out of nowhere, the city is hit by a huge cloud of smoke. What looked like smoke at first, the city quickly begins to understand that it was actually a virus. This new disease made victims fall into a coma, while they slowly suffered mutations, which gave them strange powers and behaviors that made them more aggressive. And our protagonist's role as one of the survivors is to put an end to the plague. With everything planned, they released a demo to try to capture the attentions of players and publishers, but unfortunately it failed, which allegedly led the company going bankrupt and the game being cancelled. Dino Crisis. Dino Crisis was a game that told the story of a special operations group that was sent to investigate an island that had been infested with dinosaurs that killed those who worked in the facility. When the team arrives, they are forced to fight against these dinosaurs to uncover the secrets of that island. And like the previous ones, this one also tried to have the Game Boy Color version. But due to the limitations of the Game Boy, there were several problems that the developers had to face before cancelling the game, like the size of the sprites and the recreation of the dinosaurs, and eventually they gave up and developed the game Resident Evil Gaiden. Deadlight. Deadlight was a cancelled game by Blue 52. The story took place on a boat called SS Hyperion, in which it had been invaded by creatures never seen before. As the story develops, our character tries to understand what really happened, while he uses weapons that he finds on the boat to defend himself. One of the most interesting mechanics of this game is that the creatures were afraid of a specific light, and that's why the name Deadlight. And our protagonist was forced to use that same mechanic against enemies that were unfazed by small guns. The game was created in just 6 weeks, and was pretty close to being released, but the publisher who was going to sign the contract with them allegedly changed their mind. Corpse Party. From here, things start to get more interesting. Corpse Party is a horror game made in RPG Maker for the PC-98. The game is based on students who, after a school festival, they start telling stories about ghosts, until out of nowhere, an earthquake makes them appear in a destroyed school in another dimension. That new school was cursed by ghosts and people who were trapped there, and each decision changed the fate of the story and the final result in violent ways. But the lost media came in 2006 with a remake of this game for mobile phones, in which 5 chapters were planned, but it was discontinued to make an improved version called Blood Covered. Eternal Darkness. Eternal Darkness was another survival horror game which was developed for the GameCube, but there was an old build that was being made in 1992 for the Nintendo 64, and it tells us the story of an ancient tribe which already existed before humanity, who had returned to dominate the Earth. With that, 13 volunteers came together to destroy them forever. But in 2000, with the new console GameCube, they discarded the whole version that they made for the Nintendo 64 to make the version that we know to this day. Great choice, to be honest. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is a sci-fi horror game which tells us the depressing story of humanity in the future. With evolution of technology, an AI had been developed to a point where it develops an extreme hatred for humans, which is called AM. AM kills all humanity except 5 people, in which it keeps them alive without them being able to die. This game came out on Steam, but there was a version that never saw the light of day. And this version appeared on a old British television program where in this specific episode they showed heavy moments in video games, in which they showed scenes that have never appeared in the game, like a character a baby, 2 bodies in a fridge, and even a But now the reason why this was modified remains a mystery. No known survivors and Game of Death. As I already covered this lost media in the video, I'll be quick. No Known Survivors is a lost media of a Flash game made to create hype around the game Dead Space that was being developed, where with this game, there will be a quiz about the lore in which the player could win several prizes. But in 2012, the site ended up being sold to a Japanese company, and the game was lost forever. But now let's talk about one that I've never mentioned. Game of Death was a horror game that was being made by the German team BAS. This game consists of a young man who is sent to the hospital after a car crash. While he's in a coma, he has this strange dream where he has to defeat serial killers through their own method. This game went further to the point where we would have to read documents and discover their weaknesses. But as they didn't find an interested publisher, it ended up being cancelled. Legions of Fear. There is not much about this game, but Legions of Fear was a game that mixed survival horror with point and click. The game was supposed to take place during the First World War, in which our main protagonist, Elena, ends up getting lost and she enters a mysterious castle called Wildcastle Manor. And inside, Ensign Wildcastle, probably the owner, tells her that he promised her soul to his masters. The reason this game was cancelled is confusing, because allegedly, during the development of this game, Sony was interested in the project, but wanted the SI to finish Motor Racing Traffic first, which was another game that ended up being cancelled, and at the time, Legends of Fear fell into silence. D2 and Tremors. D2 is a game that was being created by the company Warp for the Dreamcast console. But before that version came out, there was another one that was initially made for them too, Parisonic. This version begins with a pregnant passenger named Laura, in which her plane crashes due to a supernatural force. But the baby who was inside her belly is taken by the devil to be son of a widowed duke from the medieval era who sold his soul for her son. Later on, now an adult, the former child had to escape the castle and fight the devil to save his father. Eventually, when the game was almost ready, the M2 console ended up not being released, and so this project was cancelled. And speaking about cancelled, Tremors was a game that was inspired on the Tremors franchise, and for those who don't know, Tremors is a film franchise about several monsters, the main one being the Graboids, which were similar to a giant worm. But this game was supposed to be single player, in which the character would have to fight against these giant worms, while having to find several ways to not be detected. Cleric. An interestingly unique game. Cleric was a cancelled game that was being developed by Plutonian Games. The game is pretty similar to Left 4 Dead 2, and you will see why. The story sets us in the 16th century, where the dead are coming back to life, and women are disappearing. From there, our protagonist Father Aronos steps in which he goes out and investigates the mystery with the intention of putting a hand to it. But the focus of the game was not the undead, but our protagonist's internal struggles, such as his lack of faith. So much so, that in the game, in addition to our protagonist having a small musket, he had two more reliable weapons, religious symbols, in which they performed several miracles, such as scaring the dead, healing, reviving, fire, etc. As we can see from the only surviving trailer, our character will have to escort a woman home, while at the same time, he would have to fight the dead. Agartha. Agartha takes place in 1929, where after a catastrophe destroys a big part of the town, a new underground city is built called Agartha. In this city, the devil ends up being a prisoner, and so he is desperate to try to escape. But Kirk, our protagonist, would have to make several moral decisions, such as saving innocents, or releasing the devil and letting him consume the city. Basically, good and evil swings between the player's finger, where the end result was all the player's decision. But allegedly, in 2001, Sega stopped producing Dreamcasts, and unfortunately no cliché, the company that was producing the game had to cancel this project. Cold County. Cold County was a psychological horror game that was supposed to be released for the Nintendo 3DS. As we can tell from the name, it tells us about a cult. But let's slow down. In this game, we took on the role of Kavik Melik, whose mother ended up suffering from a terminal illness. And as he was unable to inform his sister, our protagonist ended up driving for hours to inform her. As the story unfolds, our character begins to ask several questions to the residents there, and from then on, the story only gets worse. They tell him about a cult that has recently moved to the town, and a suspiciously unexpected of a well-known face in town, Father Pierce. We can assume that in this game, our character was in charge of finding his sister, who somehow fell into the hands of the cult. But unfortunately, the company closed its doors in 2016. Necroscope. Necroscope was a psychological horror game which was being developed in 2002 by Mobius Entertainment. In Necroscope, our protagonist had supernatural powers to the point of being able to communicate with the dead peacefully and without physical interaction. The game was going to be based on solving puzzles while having to protect ourselves against monsters. But in 2004, when this company was bought by Rockstar, allegedly, the external projects that were being produced ended up being cancelled, and the company focused more on producing games for the PlayStation Portable. Come Midnight. Come Midnight is an interesting case. This game was being developed by the People Can Fly studio in 2004. It tells us the story of a private investigator called Michael Roy, who died temporarily but ended up coming back better than before. Now with the experience he has had, he gains a new ability that allows him to see the last seconds of someone's life by touching their corpse. But the story of how this game was cancelled is quite depressing. With the game's production, they eventually made a demo to make publishers interested in the game. They were successful. However, the studio was known for making action games and not horror games, which means it was risky to bet on such game. So that the company wouldn't go bankrupt, they left the project aside and moved on to the next one, which was also cancelled, called Raven Wolf. But during a convention, a company was interested in investing in the Come Midnight project, on which left the studio with hope to the point that they worked hard for 2 years straight. But allegedly, that same company gave up on the game, which left People Can Fly in a bad situation, but they eventually recovered with the game Bulletstorm. The Crucible. The Crucible, or better known as the box at the time, was a proposal created by the company SK, which was known for developing the game Eternal Darkness, in which they made a proposal for an open-world horror game, which was accepted by Sega in 2005. A year later, the game looked promising, to the point where even Sega showed photos of what the game would look like. That same year, the game would change its name twice, to The Crucible Evil Within, and then to The Ritualists. But in August 2008, Sega allegedly decided to cancel several external projects, one of them being this game. But through images, we can at least predict that our character will have to fight against a cult, which caused evil to come to Earth. Career to the Next Mutation, and The Thing 2. Career to the Next Mutation was supposed to be a sequel of the Career game. For those who don't know, Career tells us about an investigation team, known as Spark, sent to enter an aircraft carrier. And when they arrive, they suffer from an ambush that ends up separating them. And now, they are in charge of finding what's going on. With the first one, they planned to make a sequel, but unfortunately, it never came out. And another game that suffered from the same fate was The Thing 2, a game focused on the movie that actually came out, but due to the company closing, it was cancelled. Winter. Winter was a survivor horror game which was being developed by the N-Space for Wii. The story is somewhat similar to Cold County. It begins with a snowstorm that takes over a small town to the point where it is isolated from the others around it. Meanwhile, our protagonist, Mia, wakes up inside a destroyed ambulance without knowing how she got there. In search for answers, she ends up heading towards the nearest city, but she realizes that something is wrong. The initial objective was to keep Mia alive while having to face several realistic scenarios with very few items. You will have to prevent the character from freezing to death, starve, etc. But throughout the story, the objectives would become more complex, such as finding out why she was linked to the storm. But unfortunately, even with a lot of potential, they didn't find a publisher. Jacks of Evil. A game that mysteriously disappeared. Jacks of Evil is another horror game that was being developed between 2003 and 2004. Little is known, but this game consisted of an organization that opposed the evil forces that had taken over the city. We play as Alexei Gromov, who is sent to Shanta City, a city in Siberia, to hunt down these forces. But something is off, for this city was full of people who cooperated with the forces of evil. This organization of professional hunters would have to fight against demons, vampires, zombies, etc. But without a word being said, the game fell into silence and was never released. Lisboa and Gun Hero. Finally a game from Portugal. Lisboa was another horror game which was being created by the company Virtualcarbon in 2009. This game focused on the capital of Portugal, Lisbon, where an outbreak of a zombie virus begins to take over the country and then the entire world. It would be inspired by several films, such as 28 Days Later, Evil Dead, and the games Left 4 Dead and Resident Evil. The company opened its doors at the horror film festival known as Motel X in 2009, where it even had a demo, but unfortunately, the project was too much for the company that was just starting out. Since we're talking about zombies, Gun Hero was allegedly a game that was being developed after Medal of Honor. It tells us the story of our protagonist, who was a pilot from the SAR team, in which his team dies after the helicopter crashes after having rescued a survivor who was infected. But now, in that chaotic world, our protagonist will have to survive against zombies while having to rescue a scientist who had the cure. At the time they presented this idea, the game Dead Space had also been presented, in which Dead Space won. And this game was discarded because there was no room for two games in the same category. Insane and Campfire. Ah yes, a game that defines me in one word. Insane was another survival horror game which was being developed around 2010 by the company Volition in collaboration with the film director Guillermo del Toro. This game was intended to be the first of a trilogy, but it never happened. And the only thing that survived from this project were drawings of the enemies. But since we're talking about survival horror, have you ever heard about a game that is completely the opposite of a survival horror? Campfire was another game in which it had the idea of turning the game genre around. This game was being developed in 2003 by the Daydream software. And in this game, we were the hunter that had to kill tourists that were wandering through the forest. In it, we even had the option of choosing one of the 4 killers, but eventually, another idea that fell into the void. USS Antarctica and the Unholy. USS Antarctica was a horror and espionage game that was being created by Dark Works in 2001. The game consisted of 2 heroes from the United States who were probably in Antarctica and had to face several enemies. Not much information about these games exists, but The Unholy was a game that was being developed by Other Worlds Interactive. Through the images and the name, we can see that this game was going to be related to religion and monsters, probably an invasion of diabolical forces. Hotel and Asylum 626. This one is different from the others. Both were Flash games, which had been made by Snack Strong Studios, which was a studio that Doritos had created. These games were intended to draw attention to the brand's 2 least-selling flavors, Blackjack Pepper and Barbecue Cheddar. There are several trailers showing what the game was like, and it was so interesting to the point where we could only play the game at 6 PM until 6 AM. In the game, we had to solve several puzzles or else we will die. But it even went one step further, because in order to escape, you had to receive a call on your real phone. But now Asylum was pretty similar to the previous one, but now you're escaping from an asylum. But as both games were just advertisements to promote the flavors, they lasted for some time. Justice for Hire and Nightfall. Justice for Hire was a cancelled action and survival game that was being developed by BAP. Justice for Hire had never officially been announced, but screenshots about the game were reportedly saved. Through the photos, we managed to get a small idea that it could be similar to the Resident Evil, and in 2003, the studio closed its doors. But now Nightfall was another survival game, which was being developed at the same time as the hurdy-gurdy game. In Nightfall, the only detail we have is that our protagonist ends up falling from a helicopter in a specific area that was infested with werewolves. Manhattan and How I Spent My Summer. 2 more games with little information. Manhattan was a proposal for a survival horror game, which was being developed by Sony Cambridge in 2006, and the game was inspired by the film 28 Days Later. A film similar to the typical zombie apocalypse, but this time the disease was called Rage. The city had been quarantined from the rest of America, in which our protagonist would now have to escape the chaos, while at the same time trying to save as many people as possible. But now, How I Spent My Summer was a children's horror game for the Nintendo DS. In this game, we would have to play as Joanne, who had a chainsaw and was in charge of killing zombies. But both games, again, went silent. Virus. Virus was another survival horror game that was being developed by CISA for the PlayStation X. This sinister game tells the story of an alien virus that infects a military boat. The virus caused the infected person to fuse with the metal, to the point that it created a metallic abomination, and our character will have to fight the same creatures to escape. Honestly, a strange idea. Eon of Tears. Eon of Tears was an RPG that was being created, which was based on several events from the Bible, from Genesis to the end of times, in which our characters would have to face various challenges, creatures, and enemies as they progress through the story. Through the trailer, we can see that there is a part that shows us our protagonist arriving at one of the cities in Genesis, Sodom or Gomorrah, in which it would have been completely destroyed by God due to their iniquities. But eventually, this game was cancelled without a reason being given. Project Carbondale. Carbondale was another survival horror game which was being developed by Sega in 2003, and its development was somewhat interesting. The game consisted of an alien invasion in which they executed anything that moved, so our main objective was to survive and destroy the abominations that want to kill you. The most intriguing thing is that this game was so ambitious to the point of wanting to make hundreds of people fighting against these abominations. Now, here comes the interesting part. To develop this game, Sega allegedly had the team of developers spend 9 days in Carbondale so they could use it as inspiration for the game. It was never officially announced, but today we know that this was actually a project which unfortunately was cancelled. Dracula Hunter. Dracula Hunter was a Japanese arcade game released in 1979. The game consisted of us defending a sleeping princess from vampires who were trying to kill her. What made this game more difficult was that the projectile, which was a cross, made a completely weird trajectory, and the fact that we would also die in just one hit. And because this game turned the lost media, in 1999 there was a fan-made sequel called Dracula Buster. From here on, we see the most obscure part of this iceberg, to the point where there is no information about these entries, but only images. Acid Rain. Acid Rain was an idea for a game that was being created for the PlayStation 3 that appeared out of nowhere on the internet years ago, and then nothing more was said. From the images, we can see and speculate that the game would have an heavy setting, and something mysterious must have affected the city. Wet Corpse and Shaded Monsters vs. Humans. Through the images, in Wet Corpse, we were able to see that this was going to be a clone of Resident Evil, but this one had a small twist. We already started dead. And in Shaded Monsters vs. Humans, we could play with 6 survivors who would have to fight against monsters in a kind of palace. As interesting as creating games may seem, reality is more depressing. Games with immense potential that fail in the last step, and ideas and ambitions that are abandoned out of fear. And since you have watched to the very end, what about disturbing Videogames Iceberg? I might sound like a broken record at the end of the videos, but I cannot help myself. Thank you guys so much for the support, like seriously. Recently we had the first video to hit 100k views here on the channel, and trust me, it means the world. Okay, I will shut up, don't worry. If you want to see these videos without censorship, take a look on Patreon. Thank you guys so much, and take care, my friend.